This meeting is being recorded.
Great. Well, we're recording now, and we're so happy to be talking about church land and its conservation. We've got Sharon, Alan, and Margot with us tonight, and we're going to have some good conversation as well. So I'm going to hand it right over to them, and we can get right into it. So over to you all.
Thank you, John. It's really good to be here this evening. So my name's Sharon Hall. I'm the Bright Now campaign officer for Operation Noah. So maybe you know Operation Noah. We particularly focus on speaking with the church, trying to work with the church on the climate crisis. And our biggest campaign, perhaps to date, has been around encouraging churches to divest from fossil fuels. But we've more recently started looking at other church investments and how they can be in climate solutions, and then also looking at this topic of church land. And back in September, we published a report. I'm going to show you, even though it's going to be in mirror image, but it does exist in hard copy. These are available. Please do contact me. I can send posted examples, but I will also put a link in the chat box for you to read and share the 16-page PDF version, which is obviously much more clickable. When you see a reference that you're interested in, you can just click on it and it takes you there, which you can't do with a paper copy. So there are real advantages, as well as saving the planet by not printing too many copies. So tonight we're looking at renewing church land for people, nature and climate. I'm going to start off just giving you a brief summary of that report which is written, and then I'm really pleased to be joined by two people who I talked to, amongst many others, sort of my consultants for writing this report, Alan Radbourne and Margot Hodson, who are going to bring the topic to life more with some landscape and local scale responses, some ways of working with farmers, some inspiring case studies. So hopefully we'll sort of move between us a little bit through the evening to break up who's speaking. And if I have a coughing fit, someone else can take over, but hopefully I won't. So I will share my screen just to give you a few slides on the report. Share screen. Can you nod if you can see that all right? Thank you very much. So that's the report, Church Land and the Climate Crisis. So I'm only going to give a really quick introduction to it. I'll let you know the main three asks of our campaign. Then I'll shift into focusing particularly on agricultural land, which we're going to be doing throughout this evening, and look at why that's particularly a key issue for the church and church land. And then also look in particular at ways of reducing emissions on farms. So that's what I'm going to be doing this evening. So introducing the report content, it's a little bit small on the left there, but that's the actual contents of the report. So we start from the beginning. We don't assume prior knowledge. We explain why we think the climate crisis is really urgent and why we think the church should care about it. We talk about what land the church owns, with a particular focus on the Church of England as the largest landholders. But then we look about how we use land can be part of the problem in terms of climate emissions, but can also be part of the solution. And then we look at what land is happening at the moment, what church land is being used for, and then introduce priority areas, and then finish up talking with some next steps and what people can do now. So that's what is in the report. So it is written for a church audience, but is hopefully of interest to a range of people. So these three priority areas, you might have spotted them in the contents there, but we have identified with talking to our consultants, these three main aims for church land. We want to be encouraging growing trees. We know that it needs to be the right trees in the right place at the right time. Not every tree growing project is successful or appropriate, but we do know that we need to be growing more trees. One of the areas that we shouldn't be growing trees is on peatland. And so we look at how we can be protecting peatland, so knowing where it is and how it can be protected and restored. And then this third main area within the report looks at reducing emissions on farms and working with farmers to encourage them to conduct a carbon audit, so sort of take note of what emissions there are and make changes. So they are the main priorities that we've identified for the church. Just to give you sort of ballpark figures of the amount of land that we're talking about and how much of this is agricultural land. The church commissioners, who are the main sort of central asset holders, so they manage the Church of England's investments that are held centrally, own around 100,000 acres of land. And of that, over 85% is agricultural land. So it's really important to look at what can be done on agricultural land. We know that the diocese, 42 dioceses around England and Wales, own 70,000 acres. Actually, I think it's England, 42 anyway. 70,000 acres. They're less clear generally about what of it is agricultural land, but we've looked at 8 dioceses that do come out about how much agricultural land. And we know that even just within 8 dioceses, they total about 37% of that 70,000 acres. So there's a lot. We think probably a lot of their land is agricultural land as well, although I can't quite give you the figures. And then other church land might be included in forestry investments owned by the church commissioners. And then there are also smaller church plots of land that are owned by individual churches. But we're not just talking about that land. We're talking about some big areas of farmland, some smaller areas of farmland as well, but looking at how that can be used. So I mentioned briefly as I was introducing the contents there, that farming does cause emissions, like most activities. If you're going to run vehicles and plough up land, there are emissions caused, but that types of agriculture can also be a sink for emissions. Looking at the statistics from Church of England church buildings, we think it's great that the Church of England is also focusing on trying to reduce emissions from church buildings, but actually in 2020, there were more emissions produced by the church's farmland that they own than by all their church buildings put together. So we're not saying that to say that the Church of England are particularly bad with emissions compared to other land sources, but just to say that within the issues that they're taking seriously to look at their carbon footprint, farmland is a big one. It's one that they need to be taking seriously. Part of the reason that farming produces so much emissions is that we waste around 1/3 of all the food that's produced. So that's not just on the farmers, it's also on all of us. So that's kind of where I start in the sort of page about looking at farmland, to talk about the importance of reducing food waste, trying to take stock of what carbon emissions and other emissions that are calculated in terms of carbon emissions are being created by farms feels like an important first step. So we're trying to promote carbon audits and then talk about the importance of working collaboratively with landlords, with tenants and building community. I can't see what my slides, local farm tenants and building community. So we're not wanting to give some directive of everybody should be doing this, because different farms work very differently. And the farmers themselves know the most about how the land has worked historically and what would be useful. So others will talk more about importance of working with people rather than sort of dictating everybody should plant trees or whatever. And so then this is my last slide for now before I pass on to Alan to tell you more about some of these techniques and ways of working on farms. So just sort of listing a few of the different tools that can be used. Farm carbon audits. There's one called Farm Carbon Calculator, called Farm Tool and Agricalc. We haven't recommended one in particular. A different one might suit a different farmer, but it's important once you choose a tool to keep using the same one, because that gives you a baseline. We know that there's all sorts of more sustainable farming methods that I think Alan will talk about more, different organisations where you can find out more from them. And then sort of bringing in the importance of biodiversity and how if we do farm more sustainably, that brings in the benefits for biodiversity, but that we need to balance the needs of people and nature and the climate. So that's going to be what we'll try and bring out. So sort of the need to listen to people and what people need and recognise that we need food. This is an important thing in farming in the UK. We can't just say all this church land should suddenly be trees. we need food to be farmed, but we want it to happen in some of these better ways. So that's about what we're going to be talking about more this evening. That is what I hope Alan's going to connect to as I hand over to him. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sharon. So I'll introduce myself first of all. So as has been introduced, my name's Alan. So I am a environmental scientist that works for the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, UKCEH. So I'm based in North Wales. So our office is in Bangor, but I live on the beautiful island of Ynys Môn, Anglesey, in Northwest Wales, which is beautiful, I have to say. And so, by day, I am a scientist, and I say by day because then by night, or actually by one day a week now, I also lead a church on Anglesey called Lighthouse Church, or Capel Galedi Môn. So me and my wife, Rachel, planted the church 5 years ago out of a church in Loughborough called Open Heaven. So we were sent to plant this new community on Anglesey 2. So I also have that hat on as well. I have 3 small boys, 3 mighty men, Caleb, Bruce and Joss, who are 5, 3 and 1, that keep us particularly busy. So if you do hear crying in the background, sorry. That's my boys waking up. We managed to get them down a bit early, but my wife's out tonight, so I'm on tender hooks in case they wake up. And then to top it all off, we actually own 12 acres of land as well. So we've got a small holding with some sheep, pigs, chickens, ducks and bees, and a little bit of woodland that we coppice to feed our biomass boiler. So a particularly busy life, but a very blessed one, and very fortunate to be where we are. So why have I been invited to speak tonight? And basically it's part of something that I've been going through personally in a way, and started to explore different connections and relationships within the wider church to draw together kind of this strand of my environmental science, but also kind of my passion and desire to equip and empower the local church to engage with the environment, with our creation mandate. Like, I do really believe that we as Christians are called through our Genesis 1 mandate to care and steward the landscape really well. And so as part of that, I want to try and help equip from my science background and my understanding, bring that into a faith sphere, and to help to communicate ways that the local church can really engage in this issue. And so Sharon has come with this kind of Operation Noah booklet, and we've been able to feed into that. And I'm just really excited to see this movement of the church, because as well as Hazelnut Community Farm are fantastic examples of our engagement with land, and the church as a movement into action through faith in the community is a really powerful missional opportunity as well. And I really want to see the church wake up to this opportunity they have, that we have, to kind of share kingdom values amongst our local community, and to lead the way and pioneer a fresh way of being and doing church in the community that can reflect some of the kingdom here on our beautiful land. And so through all of that, I'm going to kind of try and put my science hat back on for a minute before I go into my church leader hat. But my science hat is, first of all, there's 2 things I really wanted to highlight just around this whole issue of sustainable land use. And one of them is to do with language. Now, you've probably heard when all these conversations happen, some people will talk about regenerative agriculture. Some people might say agri-ecological. Some, like I'm part of a project that is called Fabulous Farmers. Brilliant name, isn't it? But it's functional agrobiodiversity, says another term. Some, and we'll see what people's responses are to this, but rewilding is used a lot, especially across the media. And it's really important that we start to understand a little bit about the language we use, and how often it can be interchangeable, and there is no problem in that. But I suppose as the church and as we're exploring this, to understand a little bit about how these terms might be picked up by different people, especially when we are talking about agricultural land and engagement with maybe our local farmer that might tenant some of the local land. Because for some, the idea of a phrase like rewilding are going to be fine with that. They're going to understand kind of they'll see it more as that, like, oh, you're meaning regenerative agriculture, agroecological practices. I understand what you mean. Whereas others, and I've had this conversation with a number of farmers, that you say rewilding and suddenly their heckles are up and they're kind of like, what do you mean? We can't just turn it all into rewild, like complete wild, and leave it to be abandoned, because that wouldn't be good. And so I wanted to first of all just start by saying something about this language is really important, especially when we know who we're communicating to. Because for some farmers, the idea of rewilding is almost offensive, because they are managing their land often in the best way that they can see. And rewilding to them is about abandoning rather than managing well. So first of all, there's that. So there's many different options, many different approaches, and many different stakeholders. So when we talk about large-scale agricultural land, we have to appreciate that there are the farmer, there is the environment that they are trying to do, and they're trying to manage their land in the best way for their farm business, but also for the local environment. There's the supply chain that basically pays the farmer. There's the consumers, like as Sharon's already said, the way that we actually reduce our food waste, or what we buy and how we buy that, is really important. So there's all of these pressures. So as we begin to think about the wider aspect of how the church can engage in sustainable land use, especially on a broad scale, we have to recognize there's all these different elements. And then secondly is about carbon. Now, if you look at the media, it is all about carbon reduction, how we can reduce our emissions, how we can bury more. Like one of the projects I'm part of through my work is looking at how we can apply a basalt rock dust across vast areas of land to see if that will enhance weathering of this rock for carbon removal. So this is quite an industrial action to try and help capture some more carbon. Now we're doing the science on that, and just to see if it is a viable option in the UK. But there's some things like that that are happening. But then also there is this sustainable land use. That the key thing here that I want to just communicate is carbon cannot be our only goal. And this is just vitally important, and so often gets overlooked, especially within policy, of just farming for carbon can often be quite a negative impact on a local ecosystem, because planting certain things in certain ways or managing it in certain ways, although it might store carbon, it isn't always the best thing for the biodiversity in the area. And we have to begin to think about this whole system approach. So one of the projects that I've mentioned, Fabulous Farmers, we are very much looking at these measures and testing them to see how reduced tillage paired with a field margin of flower strips, how they can act together to be a benefit to the local crop, or how planting a hedgerow alongside some, I don't know what, manure input onto the land can help with soil erosion, which then can improve soil health, or how all of these different benefits can cross against each other to be able to produce not only a viable, sustainable business for the farm, which fundamentally does always come first, because without it, the farmer goes out of business and it doesn't matter what they're trying to do to the environment, but also how we can actually promote these things, to think about the whole system approach. And so through it all, through this kind of sustainable agriculture, the thing is that I think there is a real movement that is happening, and it is building amongst the farming community. So my dad passes me the Farmer's Guardian regularly to kind of say, here we go, son, if you want to be engaged in farming, then you've got to read this to understand what's actually going on. But it's amazing how much there is in there about regenerative or sustainable or agroecological farming to help try and promote and communicate this. It definitely is a thing that is on the horizon. With the upcoming CAP replacement, so the Common Agricultural Policy, and payments for ecosystem services or public goods, that each devolved government are trying to formulate, a lot of their focuses are to try and help support this transition to more sustainable practices. So there's some good stuff happening, but importantly, the question is, how can the church, and especially the church as a landowner, engage in this? Because as Sharon said, the Church of England especially has a huge landholding. So how can we as the church, as A, the people, but B, the organization, be able to shift that and be a pioneer in seeing that change? And I have to say, it's not a simple thing. First of all, we have to recognize that farmers are tenants, first of all, of this land. And often they are part of a long-term contract. So some will have a 40-year contract to farm that land, which means that as the church as a landholder, it is really, really difficult for them to try and shift a practice that happens on a land because a contract is in place and ultimately they don't have any say. So just imagine that you rent a property. Your landlord might say, you can paint your rooms however you want, you can decorate your house however you want, as long as you put it back to magnolia or white when you leave, that is fine. But for the time being, you live there, make it your home, farm it as you would in that way. And it's in the same way that the church doesn't have much of a say in what can really happen on its land within a contract cycle, which often can be long. Secondly, these parcels of land often, especially the ones that are owned by local churches, tend to be small parcels of land, so won't form a whole part of a farm, but will just be kind of next door to the farmer's current land. So they will tenant it because it is easy to get to. Often the tenancies can pass hands quite quickly. And so any changes that want to happen, even if you get the farmer on board, they might say, yeah, I would love to do that on your 3 acres that I manage, but I've got another 300 acres that I farm that I cannot convert fully to these sustainable systems because I don't have the equipment or so on to do that. So there's that challenge as well. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, the farm is a business ultimately. And so there are many other drivers that come in. Again, supply chain, consumers, the contracts they're part of, what they're just equipment. To buy a reduced tillage drill can cost £100,000. So for that shift to happen within a farm, to change to reduced tillage, which is better for soil health, ultimately, they just might not be physically possible to make that shift. So those are some of the things, but I do have some good news, is that from conversations I've had with some land agents within the Church Commissioners or within the Church of England, or just kind of generally within these church land spheres, is there's some real positive things happening, and people are really trying to help close some of this gap. So I know, for example, that the Church Commissioners recently had 2 whole farm tenancies come available, that they wrote into the new contract some quite high requirements for sustainable agricultural practices, and they really demanded that the person that was going to win that tenancy submitted to those things and did it in a really good way, which is a fantastic way. Now, the problem is, if these tenancies only come up every 40 years, it's going to take a long time to see that transition, too long. So how can we begin to enable that and smooth out that pathway between the landowner, the land agent that sits in the middle and does all the stuff, and the farmer to equip this kind of quicker transition? And that's some of the things that are trying to happen, but obviously progress can feel glacially slow at times, but there is some good stuff. So I'm going to pass over to Margot in a second, but just in summary of this first part, kind of on a national scale, is there are lots of challenges, and it can often feel pretty overwhelming. Like, the few of us sat here might be like, what on earth can we do to try and see this shift happen? But I believe it's our theological mandate to begin to try and see some of this shift happen, to pioneer new ways of engaging with our local community. And we're going to talk more about that. And Margot's got some fantastic examples of how this is actually already being enacted. Margot, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really helpful. My name is Margot Hodgson. I'm Director of Theology and Education at the John Ray Initiative, which is an organisation, a Christian organisation that seeks to resource the church to respond to the environmental crisis. We mostly do educational work. We're particularly working with the training of of pastors and ministers at the moment, which is really exciting to have them grasp this vision of how we can lead churches to be more caring for God's creation. That's half of my work. The other half time, I'm a rural vicar in the Cotswolds, and I've been in more rural style ministry for a long time, and have particularly worked with farmers in that area as well. And Alan and I have collaborated on projects to look at church land, which is how we got to know each other. So it's great to do something with you, Alan. Well, I'm going to talk about farmers and something more about how it feels to be a farmer. And I'm going to start with a joke. A British farmer was asked what he would do if he won millions of pounds on the lottery. He replied, "Oh, I'd just carry on farming until the money ran out." And that little bit of black humour sums up how many farmers feel right now and the reality for many farmers. Over the years, food prices have been pushed down relative to other things, and it's meant that farmers can find that the cost of producing it can be more than they actually get paid for it. It's been a problem with milk for a long time. It can be a problem for other things. When you hear about the expensive equipment, you see about the overheads they're trying to deal with. The statistics on farmers and mental health is not good. There's a higher than average level of depression and indeed suicide amongst farmers. And there's a number of reasons for this. It is a very challenging economic situation and a major one. Many farmers struggle with debt. Many are tenant farmers. If they actually own their farms, they can be asset rich, sitting on millions, and yet earn less than the national minimum wage. And that's a really weird position to be in. They're often isolated, working on their own or with their spouse, and they might worry about their spouse if they're both working too hard. Many are older and they're struggling to do what might be heavy manual work, and what they could do in their 20s and 30s, they're struggling to do when they've got into their 60s, and they're still doing it. And it might be that they're the generation that won't be able to pass it on because none of their sons and daughters are mad enough to want to follow them. And so that whole thing has been lost. And it may be that their family have farmed this land for generations, and they're going to be the one that breaks the chain. And that makes them feel like a complete failure. Then there are disasters that can happen to crops, markets, and animals. And farming can be dangerous. I always tell Alan to stop listening to all of this. Really, it's really not very friendly, but it can be dangerous. You can get really significant accidents, and they can be life-changing, and they can happen because family life and farming life are so interconnected. They can happen when you least expect it, and it's farming is one of the poorest safety record of any occupation in the UK. And then darkest of all, with suicide, as we said, they've more likely got the means to do it. And that is one of the dangers of farming. So if that's all the bleak bit, there's some wonderful bits of farming. As Alan said, you get to be in beautiful places. You get to see beautiful things, but there are some real challenges. Now, contracts can be very fickle. I know a farmer who built up a business selling bird seed to one big national company. He saw how pet food was really giving good returns, and he went into this in a big way. He was the main supplier for one company, and you would find his bird seed on sale in outlets all over the country. But a new buyer came into the company who had a policy of changing contractors, changing who she bought through on a regular basis, and she cancelled his order just like that. He was already growing next year's crop, and he nearly went bankrupt. And it had a devastating impact on him personally. I remember knowing him before when he was confident, and I remember knowing him afterwards when he just felt totally broken by the whole thing. I know another farmer who took up a government scheme to grow biofuels for the electricity for power plants. And the investment for this was hundreds of thousands of pounds in long-term crops of willow and miscanthus, which is that stuff that looks like kind of pampas grass, if you ever see it out in the fields. The problem was that the government hadn't actually consulted properly with the power plants themselves. And the farmer couldn't find a market for his crops, and his financial loss was absolutely massive. He did manage eventually to find a local outlet of a big sort of place, sort of partly tourist place that was using biofuels, and he did manage to get his market into that, but he had a very, very rocky time. Then TB testing for cattle can be very stressful. And although there's compensation, if any test positive, it can be devastating. And I know a local farmer to me here had several tests positive, and it was devastating. He's a breeder and he lost some of his best cows. And that's an awful thing to happen. And then we've all heard of the parsnips and carrots being ploughed back because they're not straight enough for the supermarket contracts, and things like that. You're tied to your contractor, but you may not actually get the sale, or you may not get the price that you expect, depending on the season, depending on the weather, depending on everything. Now, there's some really good organizations helping farmers, and I'm going to put some links in the chat box at the end so you can follow them up. One is called Farm Community Network, FCN, which was actually started by a Christian. There's quite a lot of Christian engagement with it, although it's not a Christian organization. Another is CPRE, Campaign for the Preservation of Rural England. And of course, there's National Farmers Union, and all of those work hard to support farmers. And do look at their websites. It's worth, if you want to find out more. If you're interested in organic and regenerative farming, then you might be interested in the Soil Association website. And I've also given you, I've got a link to the government one that tells you about some of these modern developments. Now, farmers have to think long term. They have to make long-term investments and long-term decisions about the type of farming they're going to do. And it's incredibly difficult if you don't know what the parameters are going to be. It's been especially difficult as we've come out of the EU with the kind of direct payment scheme and all of that involves, and all the sort of ways in which everything worked with that. Not because it maybe have been particularly good, but because they haven't known what was coming next, and they haven't been able to persuade the government to tell them early enough. The government hasn't seen the kind of the urgency for planning ahead. It's a bit like being asked to start running a race when you've no idea of the route, and you might find yourself running in totally the wrong direction and have to turn around and retrace your steps, but you have to start running. The good news is that there is some clarity now emerging, and the new schemes do shape farming decisions towards sustainability. The Environmental Land Management Schemes, or ELMS, supports 3 new schemes that will reward environmental land management. There's Sustainable Farming Incentive, Local Nature Recovery, and Landscape Recovery. And I'm giving you the government links so you'll be able to follow that up. And it makes this makes it a key time for anybody to engage with farmers, because it's a time of change, but we need to do that supportively. I've never yet met a farmer who's willing to talk about potential changes in farming until he or she felt confident that I understood something about farming and supported them. And it's the same with others engaging. They have to, I think farmers are very suspicious of people who they don't think, who come out of towns, don't know much about farming, and start telling people what to do. They want to know that people are rural people who understand and who will be able to help. So that's how, as a church, we need to be engaging with the farming community. Now that maybe leads to thinking about one major area of engagement, which is enabling our nation perhaps to shift towards a more plant-based diet. At the moment, the majority of the people in the West are eating a diet that is high in meat and dairy products. And as other people in other parts of the world become wealthier, they too want to move towards a diet that has higher levels of meat. But there's a problem with that, and a number of ways you can think about that. One is to look at the biomass of mammals globally. If you look at all of the mammals in the world, humans make up 32%, livestock and pets make up 62%, and wild animals make up just 4%. Tiny, tiny percentage. And in terms of making more space for wild, we need to do that. We need to find ways of doing that. And then meat has a higher carbon footprint than plants. And you could say, well, that means it's a no-brainer. We just need to, let's just move from livestock to arable and it'll be all nice and simple. but it's much, much more complex than that, than I think Alan sort of began to flesh out. First of all, quite a bit of British farmland is unsuitable for arable farmland. It's farming. It's really only suitable for livestock. A lot of it isn't even suitable for trees. And also livestock farming can be very positive for biodiversity. And as Alan said, you can't just do it on carbon. You have to look at the biodiversity. And we're in a biodiversity crisis just as much as we're in a climate crisis. And then if we're taking plants out of the soil, we have to put nutrients back somehow. And some of the regenerative methods of farming that have mixed farming that use livestock mixed with arable actually are far, far better for biodiversity, because you're also not using carbon to make fertilizers to fertilize the land. You're doing that much more naturally. So something like pasture for life can be really good for biodiversity and have more positive carbon outcomes potentially. That's where you grass feed beef cattle, and where you mob graze them. You take them around so they're constantly moving in different to different places. Really good for biodiversity. It's potentially good for carbon outcomes. But it is quite complex to work out the figures on all of this. I've been trying to drill down to find out how it all works. It's very difficult to find. Every field is different. Every farm is different. Different regions are different. So it's difficult to get figures. So what can we conclude? Well, my own conclusion is that we do need to encourage our population nationally to move towards a diet with lower levels of meat and dairy. And I do eat meat and dairy, but I eat perhaps an awful lot less than I did when I was growing up. You know, we've greatly reduced. We probably eat it once or twice a week, and that is a more sustainable way of eating meat. And when you do eat meat, then you can afford to buy slightly more expensive meat that's been farmed in a much more sustainable way. Then we need to engage with farmers to support them to make the most of elms and the opportunities for greater biodiversity and sustainability. And that means working with people like Alan, who have the means to help and support farmers into those sorts of ways. But we do need to remember that farms are very often small family businesses. They're very different from the big corporations like oil companies or denominations or universities. So where we're looking at divestment from fossil fuels, a kind of big campaigning approach can be a very good way of getting heard by those big corporations. When we're working with an awful lot of small family businesses on the edge of not being able to keep going, what we need to do is develop relationships with those farmers to encourage change supportively and to find helpful ways towards making that change and supporting the organisations like CPRE, like FCN, who are helping in those changes, and the Soil Association. Then finally, we have a younger couple farming locally. They're actually doing pasture for life farming, who are first generation farmers. They used to have office jobs in Bristol, and then they got an allotment and they got really passionate about their allotment. And then they decided to take a year out. One got made redundant, one got leave. They decided to take a year out to go woofing, which is working on organic farms. And they went all over the country trying different types of farming. From there, they managed to get a job on an estate in Gloucestershire. They went and got some qualifications in agriculture, and they've now got their own farm tenancy. And like Alan, they've got a young family, bring them up on this farm. So if you're younger and passionate about making farming more sustainable, and you have the creative and practical and business skills to do it, or if you're older and want to engage more with farming, you might like to try woofing, and maybe you could become part of the change. So I'll put these things in the chat box, and thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Margot. I'm going to sort of change scope slightly now and begin to focus more locally on where we as the local church and as people can begin to engage with some of these issues that we've raised that are on a national scale, but equally we are a movement locally. Like, as I was thinking about this, I was drawn to the idea of during COVID, how at the start of that, the people that were active in the community and supporting and often were thanked very publicly, like Boris Johnson, while he was Prime Minister, actively saying kind of, the church of like the Christian church that has engaged so well in community, providing these spaces and places for people to receive support in this critical moment. And the church holds this incredible key to engage and unlock that locally. And so as we pursue kind of sustainable land use and engagement, how can we be a movement, a group of people that can engage both locally to kind of feed into the national picture? And first of all, there's some education, there's some stuff around the things that Margot was just talking about there, the challenges that are faced. Like it's crazy to say, isn't it? Who would have thought 12 months ago that I would say Jeremy Clarkson potentially has a key voice in this moment? Because Clarkson's farm, no matter what you think about it, there are people that have never engaged in sustainable agriculture or agriculture full stop, that are actually watching and seeing some of the challenges that are happening there. And then there's education as a church and how we can equip people to understand their creation mandate within their faith and how to enact that. So things like eco-church, or engaging with things that Operation Noah are doing with campaigning, or to go through different series or things as a community to understand more about how we can connect with nature and creation more. Like finding out more about these sustaining conversations that Hazelnut community do are fantastic ways of doing that. And then the next step is the missional and local engagement through positive action, like green space regeneration, maybe making churchyards living spaces. Like I'm currently running a project called looking at churchyard carbon across England. So it is commissioned by the Church of England to see a kind of a citizen science survey to see what carbon might be stored within churchyards at this time. But we've also partnered with Caring for God's Acre to bring their expertise in biodiversity and understanding these churchyard spaces through projects like their Beautiful Burial Grounds project to help people really begin to see the beauty and what is held within their local space, or to kind of begin to vision cast for what it could be in the future. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if all of these churchyards that are networked across the whole of the UK, that they begin to see it not as a deathscape where we bury people, but as a living space. So maybe not mowing it to within an inch of its life to make it look clean, but actually to allow areas to grow up so that wildflowers can bloom, that there is wildlife there, butterflies and birds and bees and all of that, that these places become living spaces. Because let's face it, the church should be a living space, not a dead space, right? So as we begin to pioneer those spaces, how can we use our natural area to engage and draw people in again to these locations? And then next is about supporting local farmers, especially those that are tenants of these church lands. So if there's a bit of glebe land that your local farmer tenants, how are there ways that we can engage with these people to kind of say, how can we help as the local community? What can we do? And not to kind of say, let us come and do this or let us come and do that, but to kind of say, look, we would love to see this managed in a sustainable way. Don't say more sustainably because they might take offense, but to say, how can we help you transition to more sustainable practices, maybe so you can get access to these cap replacements, to elms and to all these schemes? How can we help you get onto those higher tiers so you get paid more for it? How can we do that? Can we get a team together to come and plant a hedge for you, to come and help you kind of harvest in a different way, to just come and buy your product direct at the farm gate so you get a better price? How can we equip and engage our local community to go and do that? And these things aren't easy, with the role of the land agent, the contracts, the patchwork of farmland that often farmers have. The local church, though, is the hope of the world. It's been said before, and I truly believe it. And if we want to see a major shift in the environment and within sustainable agriculture, how powerful and frankly a positive news story would it be, like during COVID, if the local church engaged its willpower, its creativity, its faith to see this shift happen in these areas. That's my church hat on, sorry. Margot, you've got some fantastic examples of how this can actually happen, right?
Yeah, and just as we were talking, I was thinking about the village where we used to live for 10 years, and we had a really good sustainability group in there that worked and collaborated with the church, and it was lovely because it was, you know, it was all of us together in the village. And at our leaving party, actually, a new initiative was born, which was called Relief, and Relief is kind of almost like guerrilla tree planting, except they do get permission for it. And the new housing developments going on all over this village. I might talk about it a bit later. And they are asking permission both in the older part of the village where they see a bit of land, a grassy corner on the street where you could plant a tree without it damaging the housing. And they get permission to do it. They can get somebody who will look after that tree to make sure it's watered in the summer. And they plant fruit trees and they plant nut trees so that you will have, you will also increase those things in the village. And they've recently been planting a hedge in one of the new housing developments. And that was really great to see a native hedge, which would be great for biodiversity. So if there's anything like that going on in your community, start up a Relief. I think it's a fantastic thing to be doing, and collaborate with the local green group, because that's another way you can really engage with people around you. But one of the things that I want to give one example that I think is an unusual housing estate example, but it provides a vision of what can be done. And it's called Kingsbrook, and it's an estate in the northeast edge of Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. And it's a really big, couple of thousand, 2,000-3,000 houses going on into that estate. And the project is by Barratt Homes, and they had 11 separate landowners that they wanted to buy land from. And one of those was the Diocese of Oxford. Now, the head of Gleben Buildings in Oxford, somebody called David Mason, who's got a huge vision for environment, for biodiversity, for developing land and housing for good use in all sorts of different ways. And they managed to get something that's called an equalisation agreement, which meant that all of the landowners got the same price per acre, so that they weren't all bidding to get the houses on their land. They were able to actually plan it. And that meant that the diocese also could put forward the idea to have a nature reserve area on their land. It's a big site, but they were able to get that agreed. Now, the developer had a vision for a more eco-friendly development with nature reserve areas and wetland areas. And from the beginning, they entered into a partnership with the RSPB, which I just think is quite amazing, really. And they worked with them on its development. Now, the diocese land got signed over to be a major wetland nature reserve on the edge of this development. It was put under covenant, so it will never be built on. It will always be a nature reserve, which is absolutely amazing. And it has been used before. It was used for livestock farming rather than arable. It had probably been improved, which meant it's probably had fertilizers and pesticides on it, but it hadn't ever been, hadn't been ploughed up. So it was an interesting place to develop that sort of reserve. The development had all sorts of things happening with it. They used the where they wanted to make the nature reserve, they dug those areas out to make the wetland, but then they used that in the development for topsoil and things. And so it was worked all well in together. But one of the really amazing things was in these new houses, they were putting in plastic bricks that were swift boxes and were bat boxes, so that you could be sure the bats wouldn't get into your attic, but they would be able to give them a home, and House Martin cups. And they were making sure that there were hedgehog runs through the gardens and all sorts of things that was going to create biodiversity. And then lots and lots of trees and other things. In fact, over 60% of the development was dedicated to green infrastructure. And they were put in wildflower meadows, ponds, woodlands, orchards. So it's and allotments, a really amazing development. They had bee hotels, they had deadwood features, they had composting things. They kept the original hedges and trees. So often in previous years. So often those have been swept away. They're much more being kept now. I haven't said about the local church itself. They've got a church plant going into there, and that's been working really creatively with young families. And I first heard about the site because of that. So that's, again, a very creative thing. So it's actually quite, I found it quite inspirational. No housing development is perfect, but this did seem to be about as wildlife friendly as possible. It actually got an award for its partnership with the RSPB. And I did begin to think, I wouldn't mind living there. It did look quite good. But I think what I want to draw from it is an encouragement to work with developers. If there are developments going on in your community, actually work with the developments, work with your local council, work if it's glebe land, work with the diocese and other landowners to try and get agreements to have wildlife, biodiverse developments going on, because there can be a huge difference between a bleak housing area, which won't be good for the people either, and one that is much more biodiverse. I said that our head of buildings and grebes also got a real vision with the housing. He, in our own village in Hadnam, he had a development where he made sure that there was a mixture of housing, a higher level of low cost and social housing than average, and that it was mixed in amongst, so that you'd have retirement housing next to families and a much more integrated. And those sorts of things will make much, much happier, much better communities. In my village in Hadnam, we were having to close the churchyard, and that was a really tough thing because we had quite a lot of, we had about 10 burials a year. So we were looking to see what to do about that. There wasn't any other means of burial in the village. And one of the thoughts was, with a glebe where there was going to be a housing development, was to develop part of that. And we had this vision for both a traditional burial ground, but also a natural burial ground, which much more like Alan was saying, you know, living rather than dead, with nature reserve on top and burials below that would be unmarked and would be a really sustainable way of a sort of 21st century way of dealing with the inevitable, that we all do die. In the end, I think it's a new local natural burial grounds has set up before the one from the diocese has been able to go, but it was a great idea. And again, I'd encourage you to think about some of those ideas. So if that just gives you some thoughts on what you can do, I know of another number of villages where there is glebe who have actually gained permission to plant trees for the Queen's Green Canopy, which is something that was happening last year, is still ongoing and is a memorial to the Queen. And that's a really good way of doing it. Or if you've got a bit of spare land, if you're in a city and your church, you know, whatever sort of church does have space to plant a tree, you could do that. You could get it part of that canopy. So I think what I want to bring out of this one and my previous one is that it is all about engagement and relationship, and trying to get to know people, trying to engage, trying to support the organisations that are doing that. If you are in an Anglican diocese that has got glebe, find out who's on the glebe committee, get engaged with it, share, see if there is somebody with a sustainable vision, with a heart for God's creation who's there. And that can be a really good way of beginning to get that that whole agenda through of being able to make everything biodiverse. So I think I'll probably hand back to Sharon now.
I'm going to try and round up really quickly because I really want to leave some time for Q&A. But it's been really great to hear some of the different examples from both Alan and Margot. I'll just share my screen again really quickly. So in terms of next steps and sort of picking up more of the issues from the report, and there are plenty more case studies within the report as well. So I would encourage you to download and read and share that, look at some of the resources in the back of the report. Please do get in touch with me if you'd like to be part of progress and campaigning on this. I've put my email address there, but actually after the next slide, I'm going to share a link in the chat box, which lets you sign up as well on a Google form. So sort of trying to look back at sort of campaigning steps and how we as individuals and others that we're in contact with can try and make the changes on the bigger scale as well as doing the local things. I want to encourage you to try and find out a bit more about land in your diocese or your local church area, and feel free to contact me at Operation Noah, because we've done some research already, so I'm very happy to share whatever we've found about your local area. But then maybe think about getting in touch with your diocese environmental officer, that's DEO, your bishop, your environment team, to see where they've identified changes that can be made. We really want to have a positive campaign, see the positive steps that are happening and celebrate them more. So when we hear about hedge planting and we hear about people protecting peat in church land, we really want to share this and say, this is great. Maybe your area could do something similar. So do let us know if you find out about positive case studies that are going on, and then encourage people to try and use their influence, whether that's at local or national level. If you know a church commissioner, feel free to talk to them. But we recognise different people have got different connections, and if we work together and look to work together with farmers and with landowners and with land agents, as we've been saying, I think there are some really positive things that can happen. So I'm going to stop there and hand over back to John for any questions and answers people have, but I will share another link now which hopefully will work to let you sign up if you'd like to know more about the Church Land campaign from Operation Noah. Oh, not Church Land.
Thank you so much. Wow, I think this has just been fantastic. Really a lot of amazing information. And this is why it's so good that we're recording this, because I feel like this is the type of night where you can go back and watch this and grab a lot of that information as well. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat now, because we've got everyone here and we can field those now. So yeah, I guess one of my questions is around the church and its kind of carbon footprint. It just feels like sometimes that's obviously important work, carbon footprint, but it feels like it's a really heavy first step for a vicar to take. Like, we're not, say you're not doing anything green and you're like wanting to start, and the first thing is like get a biomass, like it's just like huge amounts of money. It doesn't actually, you can't see an effect actually in terms of your ministry or the good for the community. So I think part of what Hazelnut's doing is saying, engage with creation and begin those steps. What are your thoughts on kind of the downside of starting too big rather than taking initial steps and engaging with some of this stuff?
Yeah, I think I really recommend Eco Church. I think it's a great way to start. And I think it's always good to just focus on one or two things that you can do. I mean, our sustainability group in our village transition group was really good at doing specific projects like this relief one, rather than trying to do everything. And if you are, I'm in huge medieval buildings, you're not going to be able to make those carbon neutral very easily. Although actually having a blanket rather than heating does work quite well. Don't heat them very well. Not to, I think sometimes the building, particularly if it's not being used every day, isn't necessarily the starting point. It's often the lifestyle of the people that you're with, and that can be fun in seeing what you can do about that.
There's some around church land as well. So hopefully my report on kind of this small citizen science survey will be out kind of around Easter to kind of see, well, what's the baseline carbon do we expect in these landscapes, and then how could we manage that, or what kind of role can that play within these net zero targets that the church has. But yeah, I don't have any data from that yet, so I can't say whether they're sources or sinks yet. But yeah, more to come soon. Keep your eyes peeled.
Fantastic. Any other questions?
I've got a question about kind of the balance of protecting biodiversity and doing the farming. So I thought everything you said was very, very interesting. I got the feeling that preserving biodiversity and farming you were talking about in slightly separate ways. And it seems to me you can't really win in some ways, because if you protect biodiversity over farming, you end up with the George Monbiot, we need Jurassic Park and everybody eating plastic burgers, which then that's not very profitable. So you have to go into the elms, which then ties farms into very lengthy agreements again, because a tree doesn't grow overnight. And if you're reforesting, then that farmer's going to have to do that for the next 40 years and not be able to crop it. So yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the balance of that and commodifying nature.
Yeah, it's the question that floats round and round, is the difference between land sharing and land sparing. So how much can we farm with, and how much do we actually just kind of need to separate it out and intensify this area and just leave that to nature and hope that the balance is right. It's a really good question. That is why, as Margot said, I think that a lot of the elms or the Sustainable Farm Scheme in Wales and Scotland have their own thing as well, of trying to work out these payment schemes has been a very difficult task, because how should you approach that? All farms are different, all landscapes are different. What should we do? And like my perspective, so like the Fabulous Farmers project that we've been running has very much been about this functional biodiversity. So how can we increase biodiversity on our farms, but do it in a way that brings us a functional benefit? So taking out a strip of land for flower margins can attract beneficial species. That means that you need to use less pesticides. So although you've taken out a strip of land from production, but often it's usually the margins that aren't very productive, you then have less inputs, which not only has an environmental benefit of not putting chemicals on, but also has a business benefit because you've got less inputs. Yeah, the benefits of hedgerows that create shelter belts, so that again it can attract beneficial species, or it can with livestock it can help reduce wind or sun stress and so on, which can help. There's all these different ways that we can kind of tie these things together, and there is a better way. However, the issue is that to make those steps often takes quite a lot of bravery. There's quite a lot of uncertainty around it. So there's, for every success story, there's a story where the hedgerow didn't take, or actually they don't see any beneficial species, so they still need to put all the pesticide on. And so trying to explore that in different landscapes and different farming, a lot of farmers just don't know how to do it. Reduced tillage, like, what does it mean? How do I get rid of my weeds? Does that mean I just need to put on a load of herbicide? And what benefits that? It's all these kind of challenges that are coming through, because ultimately, like, the organic movement is fantastic, but it can't be the only answer, because we can't have just a complete organic system, probably anyway, not the way it's structured at the minute. So it is, you pick on a great question of how do we find that balance, and how do we farm for food production, how do we farm for business, yet also meet all these goals? And I don't have the answers, unfortunately, and I think that's what we're still trying to explore and trying to help engage and increase education and an understanding of what we're finding, and yeah, still to be played out. But there's lots of good examples on small and large scale that are happening. One fantastic, if you're interested in that stuff, the what would it be, like, farming festival called Groundswell is a brilliant place to go and like see some of these examples of people doing these regenerative practices really well. I went for the first time last year and going back this year, and it's a brilliant kind of space to see some inspiring stories of what's happening in agriculture, to try and find systems that will work and be profitable still.
Yeah, one of the controversial things around is using land for solar, and there's a big project going ahead in our area, which is very, very controversial. One of the things they're saying though is that they're going to really use the land for biodiversity and have lots of wildflower meadows. And you can sometimes have even layering when you graze sheep with your solar. And if you particularly do that in meadowland, which is floods regularly and it's not going to be much good for other things, you could actually have something quite good. But I think the bravery of a farmer who begins to take on something as complex as that, but those sorts of things are potentially there.
And there's those connections to the local community then, like those solar farms. I know there was a big one planned on Anglesey that the community came out and said, can't have that, that's not possible. Like, as in, we want like carbon neutral energy, but can we have it from over there, not in my patch, not where I am? And the risk of putting sheep underneath solar panels, we have some solar panels at the top of our land, and the sheep used to go and nibble on the wires and pull them apart. And it would take weeks before I realized, why have we got no energy coming in? So yeah, so you got to still fence it off or tie the ropes up. Fortunately, we had no fried sheep though, so that was okay. We survived.
Great. Really good stuff. One of these we're doing at Hazelnut is just kind of a new thing, is thinking about how to make things sustainable as well. So we're joining with, because we're very urban here in Bristol, and we're a new church plant. And so they've kind of said, well, you've got X amount of time before the funding stops and you've got to pay all your own bills. And it's like, it's quite a bit of stress. So we're like, well, one of our greatest resources is land is obviously quite scarce here. So it's people, so how do we educate and help people on a very small piece of land? But we're connecting with a large 35 acres out in Pembrokeshire in Wales. It's a little farther away, but they're already kind of doing some amazing things there and camping and different things. So I suppose one of the questions is for us is how do rural churches connect with urban churches rather than not talk to one another? And then together we're going to kind of try and figure out how to do sustainable eco enterprise, basically. So look after our land and our people, but also see how we can generate some income on it as well. So it's a big question. I don't know if I'll have the answer for it, but that's one of the things we're kind of experimenting with. Can I just say a quick, I'm going to do a couple of announcements, but before I do that, we'll stop the recording. But I just want to say a quick, huge thank you for all the information. And it was absolutely fantastic tonight. And thank you so much for all of this input. It was really, really good. I really appreciate it.